How can we expect righteousness to prevail unless there are people willing to give themselves up for a righteous cause? Hans and Sophie Scholl were university students in Germany during the Second World War. Hans and his friends, drawn together through a shared love of art, music, literature, philosophy, theology, became disillusioned with Nazi ideology and decided to become political. They wrote pamphlets to turn the German public against the Nazi regime. Adopt passive resistance, they wrote. Block the functioning of this atheistic war machine before it is too late, before the last city is reduced to a heap of rubble, before the last youth of our nation bleeds to death. Do not forget that each people gets the government it deserves. They distributed these pamphlets anonymously, signed only as the White Rose, because speaking out against the Nazis was dangerous. When Sophie discovered what her brother was up to, she joined the resistance too. And for months, the White Rose they spread pamphlets all around Germany. On the 18th of February in 1943, Hans and Sophie were distributing pamphlets at Ludwig Maximilian University when a janitor, loyal to the Nazis, spotted them. They were arrested by the Gestapo and 4 days later hauled before a Nazi court for a show trial. They were allowed no testimony or defense. Sophie interrupted the judge. Somebody, after all, had to make a start. What we wrote and said is also believed by many others. They just don't dare express themselves as we did. They were convicted of treason that day, sentenced to death, and executed by guillotine a few hours later. Before her execution, Sophie said, "How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there is hardly anyone willing to give himself up to a righteous cause?" Such a fine, sunny day, and I have to go. But what does my death matter if through us thousands are awakened and stirred to action? Her last words were most likely either, "God, my refuge into eternity," or "The sun still shines." And at the moment of his execution, as the blade dropped, Hans shouted, "Es lebe die Freiheit." Long live freedom. The White Rose became a symbol of resistance to the Nazis. And after their execution, their sixth and final pamphlet was smuggled out of Germany through Scandinavia to England, and the Allies airdropped millions of copies all across Germany, retitled "The Manifesto of the Students of Munich." Now, we don't face the guillotine, but every day in Canada, hundreds of vulnerable people are killed by abortion and euthanasia. And we don't live in a fascist dictatorship with show trials and beheadings of political dissidents. But this is a life and death question for the vulnerable among us. Though Canada may be bad when it comes to life issues and freedom of expression, we still live in a rules-based democracy, at least somewhat, as broken as it may be. And the cost to us speaking up is not as heavy as the cost to the white rose, but it is still a life and death question for the vulnerable among us, for vulnerable preborn children, and for the suicidal. Pro-choice politicians and activists seek to silence the pro-life message. But we can fight back legally and democratically to defend our voice, to continue to be a voice for the vulnerable. And we must stand up to defend our freedom of expression if we're going to continue to be a voice for those who are in need. So as was said in the introduction, my name is Blaise. I volunteer as the Vice President on the board of Toronto Right to Life and the Region 5 Director for AFLO, and I work as the Eastern Strategic Initiatives Director for CCBR. And in this session, I want to bring us back to the abortion issue, for the most part, and back to the basics of what it is we need to do to change hearts and minds to make abortion unthinkable, but how we need to be able to defend our own freedom of expression, our own right to free speech, if we are going to continue to do that. I'm not a lawyer, but I will be sharing from my experience with the examples that I'm most familiar with of pushing back legally and politically to defend pro-life free speech. And I want to share some examples to give you a sense of how we can fight back effectively and to bring you up to speed on what's going on now, in particular with bylaws to restrict photos, attempting to restrict photos of preborn children. I'm going to give a few examples in general of how we can stand up in defiance of these efforts to suppress the pro-life message. These aren't the only examples, they're the examples that I'm most familiar with. But I want to show that when we stand up, we will win some, we will lose some, but it will always be better if we fight than if we don't. And that we can check abuses of power, we can set precedent, we can deter pro-choice violence, and we can win. And with efforts to censor images of preborn children right now in particular in the public square, we must stand up. We cannot let abortion advocates hide preborn children from the public view. When lives are on the line, silence is not an option, and we must stand up and defend our voice. The first battle that I was heavily involved with was of this nature, was the Canada Summer Jobs abortion attestation. Because in 2016, Toronto Right to Life applied for funding under the Canada Summer Jobs program, and we were granted funding. And we hired 4 summer interns and held a small internship program. And in 2017, we put the same application in, and we were told we were not eligible for an unspecified reason. So along with Guelph Right to Life and the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform, we filed a charter challenge, and the government settled with us and paid us the money that they had owed us because they had no reason in the program to deny us. But then they came back, and for 2018, put a reason in, and they put the abortion attestation in, that you had to pledge your support for safe and legal abortion in order to qualify. And Toronto Right to Life was first over the hill. We had been in the fight already, and we filed another charter challenge that January. I remember having that call with my wife as we were talking with our legal team and being like, so we're doing another charter challenge. He's like, yeah. It's like, something a little different this time. And they're like, and she's like, okay. I'm like, so I've been asked if I could put my name on it in particular as the president of Toronto Right to Life. That was a different step and a different level of involvement. But we filed that charter challenge. And after us, several other groups did as well in the months afterwards, filed legal cases. And some of those cases were successful in the public, in the international media. There was controversy and pushback for the move that the federal government had made. And the government backed down somewhat. They narrowed their attestation. They had caught so many people in the net the first time, I think, because they honestly did not anticipate how many Canadians were against abortion or how many people would have a conscientious objection. They backed off, but they narrowed the noose on pro-life groups in the 2019 attestation. And we continued our legal battle. And while some cases succeeded in checking government power, we ultimately lost our case. The courts agreed with us on some matters, but they ruled that the government was clear to violate our freedom of religion and freedom of expression. And we appealed that ruling, but the courts ruled that it was moot. The 2018 attestation had already been abandoned. The first over the top often takes the brunt of the fire, and that's what it felt like in the Canada Summer Jobs battle. But I often think about what the alternative would be if so many of us had not fought back. Right? Our federal government promised when they were elected 9 years ago that they would strip charitable status away. I don't know if it was the 2015 election, but they promised in one of the elections they would strip charitable status away from groups that hold pro-life beliefs. When the abortion attestation first came out, there was talk of expanding it to other programs. We did not get rid of the attestation. Pro-life groups are still denied this funding and still discriminated against. But imagine how much further that discrimination could have gone if we didn't fight back. So even when we don't win, it's important to stand up so the other side knows that we're willing to fight back and we can put a check on government power. Now, another case that I've been involved with is with my good friend Talia, who was the first over the top at the university formerly known as Ryerson, when with Toronto Against Abortion, we brought abortion victim photography and human rights apologetics to the streets every week on campus. And we took what was a settled issue and turned it into an unsettled issue. And when Talia started with activism at Ryerson, she was the only Ryerson student who was willing to take a public stand on the issue of abortion because she got a lot of flack for it. We had signs stolen and assaults and all kinds of police reports filed, but Talia in particular, as the Ryerson team leader, she faced discrimination from the student union. As a racialized student, they denied her access to the Racialized Students Collective simply because she was pro-life. As a student with a disability, she has type 1 diabetes. They denied her access to the Student Union Equity Center for students with disabilities. As a survivor of sexual assault, they denied her access to a healing event for rape victims simply because she held pro-life beliefs. They said that her mere presence was a problem simply because she held different beliefs. Now, not only did Talia not back down, we continued to bring the truth about abortion to the streets of Ryerson every week. We continue to do that. But Talia stood up legally. She filed a complaint with the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, which has been moving ever so slowly in that Kafka-esque organization. But several years later, this was filed in 2017, she finally had a hearing on a preliminary question in 2022. The other side was trying to say, she was alleging discrimination based on her pro-life creed. The other side was saying That's not a creed, and she has no reasonable chance of success. And the argument that she was making was novel. Creed has traditionally referred to traditional religious beliefs, but there was a change from the Ontario Human Rights Commission that broadened the definition of creed, and she filed her claim alleging that her pro-life beliefs should count. And in January of 2023, the tribunal ruled in her favor on the preliminary question, but ruled in her favor that her pro-life beliefs, rooted in the teachings of Catholic Church, trigger the protection of the Ontario Human Rights Code against discrimination. So her case is heading towards a hearing against the university and against the student union for the treatment that she faced. And because she stood up, so many other Ryerson students afterwards had got involved. She used to be the only student. But when she went over the hill, when she took the brunt of the fire, when she fought back, it made a difference. I remember one of the counter-protesters saying on the streets once to somebody else who was touching one of our signs, "Oh, don't touch their signs. They're a-holes and they will sue you," were the almost exact words. And it would be nice if they learned not to do it because it's wrong, but they learned not to do it. And we fought back legally against the pro-choice violence that we were facing on campus as well. My colleague Katie from Toronto Right to Life and I were assaulted doing outreach. And the student from the counter-protest group who assaulted us was arrested, charged with assault with a weapon, and she pled guilty. And we filed a claim for damages against her for the assaults. That claim is still going through small claims court. Actually, we have a hearing coming up. This assault was back in 2018, but the pandemic slowed down a lot of things in the courts. We actually have a hearing coming up next Friday on the matter to hopefully move it forward. But we pushed back in criminal court, we pushed back in small claims court as well. And since these assaults in 2018, since Talia's human rights complaint, after 2 years of regular outreach with constant police reports and constant issues and struggles to get the university or police to take things seriously, we have not had an incident from the counter-protest group since. We've changed the culture on campus. We still have to deal with issues, but it changes the way people respond. I was talking to a team leader from CCBR summer internship just on Thursday, and she brought our team doing outreach in front of a public high school where pro-lifers would never be allowed inside the school. We go out on the streets in front to bring the pro-life message to the students. And she had been there a couple of years ago, and it was very rough. The students responded with a lot of hostility and violence. And we had come back, and we respond with kindness, with compassion, but when people break the law, we respond legally. And she said that she heard a student at that school say, like, "Oh, you shouldn't touch their stuff. Like, I heard someone got arrested or got in trouble with police for that." Right? So we push back, we stand up for our rights because it changes. Like every opportunity when somebody tries to discriminate against us, when somebody tries to assault us or to steal property or to exclude pro-lifers from spaces simply because we have pro-life beliefs or to censor and suppress the pro-life message, it's either an opportunity for them to get away with it and be emboldened, or for us to push back, stand up, and show that we can and will fight back and can make a difference. And we can see that in the deterrence. We can see that in precedent that can get set, like Talia has set now, for anyone, regardless of whether her claim is ultimately successful. She has set precedent now that anyone in Ontario who faces discrimination because of their pro-life beliefs, rooted in a religious faith, could seek remedy under the Ontario Human Rights Code. And that wasn't a thing before she started the fight. So the main issue today that I want to highlight for you, and I have info cards here with a link with what you're seeing on the screen, I'll pass these out afterwards, is a coalition effort from several pro-life groups to push back against efforts to censor and suppress the use of fetal imagery in the public. Abortion advocates and pro-choice politicians are trying to hide the preborn child from the public view. As Jackie mentioned earlier, the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada has been seeking to suppress pro-life free speech in all sorts of ways, but fetal imagery as well for years. And a group started in London in 2020 called the Viewer Discretion Legislation Coalition, focused on this particular question. And several cities in several municipalities in Ontario and Alberta have passed bylaws that restrict the use of images of fetuses in leaflets being delivered to doors. Now, they say it's about graphic imagery, but the definition of graphic image in most of these bylaws is any image of a fetus. So it includes abortion victim photography, and it also includes ultrasound photos, being defined as graphic imagery and being censored by these bylaws. Several municipalities have passed them. Several are considering them right now. And some municipalities have moved beyond bylaws simply not simply, but moved past bylaws restricting fetal imagery on leaflets to homes to also explore citywide bans for displaying any imagery of preborn children. Now, our friends at the Association for Reformed Political Action filed a legal challenge in February against the city of St. Catharines, one of the cities with these bylaws. I think this coming week there's cross-examination of the witnesses, and I've heard that there's a hearing date set for September. So the case is moving forward, but they've taken aim at one of these bylaws, and if successful, it could it would affect, any ruling would affect any of these other similar bylaws in other cities. So there's a push back legally to challenge and hopefully strike down these bylaws. But we're also fighting back politically. A coalition of pro-life groups have banded together to mobilize pro-lifers to speak up and defend our voice so we can continue to be a voice for voiceless preborn children. So in particular now, there are 4 municipalities in Ontario that are quite actively considering the question. The cities of Toronto and Hamilton are looking at bylaws against fetal imagery for leaflets and for signs on the streets. London already has the leaflets bylaw, but they're looking at expanding it to the entire street. The draft proposal, just to give you a sense of how these governments are thinking. The last report that came out a few months ago that thankfully they haven't moved forward with, but the proposal before City Council until they saw the lawsuit in St. Catharines was to redefine the streets bylaw so that displaying any image of a fetus would count as obstructing the roadway, would count as causing a public nuisance, just reinventing what these things mean in order to try to find ways to make it illegal, to bring our culture face to face with the victims of abortion, with both photos of healthy children and of children who've been killed. Right? We know that in order to change hearts and minds on abortion, in order to rehumanize those children who are being dehumanized, we need to bring our culture face to face with the victims so that people see that abortion is not just about a what, but it's about a who. So that people can see the unique, unrepeatable, individual, personal someones who are being killed by abortion. So obviously, people who support the status quo, abortion legal through all 9 months of pregnancy for any reason or no reason, obviously they don't want the victims of abortion to be seen. They want to keep the bodies covered up. They don't want photos visible that can rehumanize the preborn child, but it is essential to defend our voice and our ability to show children to the public if we are going to change hearts and minds and save lives. And they start by coming after imagery, but the same groups who have been attacking pro-life speech on on fetal imagery have also gone after pro-life speech, even when we just use our words without photos. So we have to take a stand where the battle is in order to defend our free speech. That's happening through the legal challenge, but a key part of this Defend Our Voice campaign is the coalition of groups that have come together: AFLO, Campaign Life Coalition, Toronto Right to Life, For Life London, London Against Abortion, Hamilton Against Abortion, We Need a Law, Citizen Go. The groups that have come together, we have a one-stop shop on this website where you can find out what's going on with these bylaws. You can see the reports that are happening, you can see where it's being passed, but in the cities where it's being considered right now, we need pro-lifers from all across the country, no matter where you live, to sign the petitions and send emails to these city councils. We need to change this from a one-sided issue of neighborhood complaints that councillors are responding on to a two-sided issue, a controversial issue. And especially if you're a constituent in one of these cities, I should mention the fourth is Niagara region. The regional municipality of Niagara is also considering these bylaws right now. If you are a constituent in the region of Niagara or City of Hamilton, City of London, City of Toronto, we have resources on the website, a webinar, talking points that can equip you to meet with your elected representatives as a constituent. And this makes a difference. My friend Maria, the president of London Against Abortion, she spoke to a London city councillor who had voted in favor of this question at an earlier stage of researching and looking into the report further. When she spoke to this councillor, he told her at the start of the conversation, he's like, I'm not sure what I think about this. Like, I'm not promising to vote against this. I'm kind of undecided. And she used the talking points that we use in the campaign, that the Charter protects all nonviolent expressive activity. It protects our right to show photos, ultrasound photos, and victim photography. 1. 2, that the use of victim photography is essential in public discourse in a democracy when we talk about difficult issues. We can see this happening on so many other issues in our society. And 3, the pro-life movement is motivated by love for preborn children and for women facing difficult pregnancies and for families who've experienced abortion, and to tell our story as a movement. And she brought this into her conversation with the councillor. And at the next meeting, not only did he vote against the report, but he spoke out against it, and he spoke out against it strongly. He said, I'm not going to vote for this. I'm not even going to vote to research the question any further, because I don't think we should be touching this at all. This is a freedom of expression issue. And he pointed to examples like with the war between Israel and Hamas, where both sides are using victim photography, and it's part of the public discourse on a contentious issue in society. He used the talking points to argue against it, and his vote flipped. Right? We can make a difference. We can sway politicians. With the City of Toronto, they've been considering this for years. And in 2019, they put a report out. And they noted in the report that they had received hundreds of emails on both sides, and it was a really contentious issue, a tricky charter question, and they wanted to research it further. We succeeded in making it a two-sided issue. Not just like the abortion advocates are speaking to their elected representatives. If we don't stand up, we don't stand a chance. But we can reframe the conversation, make it a two-sided and controversial issue, and we can change outcomes. There's the possibility to change outcomes here. So you can find out more about what's going on at defendourvoice.ca. There's information. I'll pass along these postcards as well. And I think this is something novel and urgent that is happening in Canada now. Right? There are threats to freedom of speech in many places across the world, but in Canada right now, the Canadian pro-life movement is being targeted. Preborn children in Canada are being targeted as abortion advocates and politicians try to hide them from public view. And how this battle ends, I think, can determine the trajectory we're on for pro-life free speech in the decades ahead. This is where the battle's happening now. We need to push back both legally and politically. And the coalition of pro-life organizations, we need as many pro-lifers as possible to be standing up and speaking up about this issue. And when we're the first, when we go over the top and we enter the line of fire and we bring an unpopular message to the culture, there will be challenges. The answer cannot be to avoid conflict, as we've been hearing all throughout the day. But as we bring the truth to the public, we need to be able to stand up for our rights along the way, and it can work. We can win, we can set precedent. I want to share one last example with you from a recent case that I haven't shared publicly. One of the projects in my day job with my CCBR hat on, last year we ran a national tour, a Faces of Abortion tour, bringing the faces of the victims across the country, bringing photos that had never been seen before in Canada to the Canadian public. Through the course of the year, there were 4.5 million views of abortion victim photography estimated across Canada from not only CCBR, but all of the partner organizations in the End the Killing movement that run End the Killing outreach projects. But one of the new projects that we launched was a video truck. Because if a photo is worth 1,000 words, a video is worth 1,000,000. I helped to bring this video truck to Canada, the second of its kind. The first was launched by Created Equal in Ohio. And I drove it from Halifax to Toronto on the tour. And a year ago, on Sunday, June the 18th, I was driving the video truck along the highway. And on the highway, we just put up photos, not video, just a photo slideshow. I was driving the truck across the highway, showing the faces of abortion victims while traveling the country. And there had been a few police officers who had pulled me over. Not many people are using video track technology. You'll see them in Toronto, and actually you'll see victim imagery on some video trucks in Toronto. I've seen imagery from October 7th on video trucks in Toronto. But for many police, this is new. When the first officer who pulled me over outside Quebec City took issue, I said, "Yes, officer, I understand they're difficult to see. What law am I breaking?" He says, "Law? I don't know." Goes back, does his research, come back, says, "I guess it's the liberty of expression," and he lets me go. Same thing happens in Montreal the next day. What law am I breaking? No law. They say, "Well, we're going to ask, would you be willing to turn the screens off for the night?" Grand Prix was on. There were thousands of people in the streets. I said, "Am I breaking any law?" He said, "No." I said, "With respect, then, I'm going to keep them on." I was about to pack up for the night, so I had to do another lap. So I had to just take another hour. But we were breaking new ground to be able to show abortion victim video and establish new precedent. But on Sunday, June the 18th, outside of Brockville, an OPP officer pulled me over. And in a few short minutes, she gave me a ticket for careless driving. She said that the screens were flashing. It's the same as the LED billboards you see all across the 401, giant ones. I set them the same every 10 to 20 seconds. But she said that the photos in particular could be disturbing and distracting to other drivers, and therefore gave me a careless driving ticket. Now, that's not what careless driving means under the law. Careless driving is about how you drive, not what your vehicle looks like. But she gave me the ticket, and we have to decide whether to fight it or not. And I was told at the time, as we were looking into this, that the maximum penalty for careless driving, unlikely, but if they were really to throw the book at you, could be up to 2 years of license suspension, or up to 6 months in prison. Now, that was also not a fun conversation to have with my wife, as okay, it's unlikely, but there is a non-zero chance that I may wind up in prison. We decided to fight it anyways, because I couldn't stand for an officer shutting down projects with no basis in law, shutting down our ability to make the victims visible. There was a trial in March, and we don't have show trials with beheadings in Canada, but sometimes the rulings are baffling, and it is hard to know how the courts are going to rule. But there was a ruling delivered in April, and the judge, the Justice of the Peace, said it was a novel question, that she couldn't find any case law on LED screens on vehicles and the question of careless driving, or LED screens on vehicles in general. But my lawyer, Leah Mills, made the case that this is not what careless driving means under the law. She interrogated the officer. Did he make any unsafe lane changes? No. Was he speeding? No. And was he operating his vehicle in dangerous manners? No, no, no. And the Justice of the Peace ruled with us on every count. She threw the ticket out, and she said that's not what careless driving means under the law, and we set new precedent. So we can win. Talia set precedent. Fighting this careless driving ticket set precedent. We don't always win, but we always do better when we stand up than if we don't. And that's a lesson that I learned from two heroes of mine, Carol Crossan and Alberto Polizagopoulos. Carol Crossan was our lawyer at Toronto Right to Life on the Canada Summer Jobs case and on the case of the Ryerson assaults. She was Talia's lawyer on the human rights complaint. And she died of cancer in January 2023, 10 days before the ruling where Talia won and where Carol's arguments at the hearing. It was Carol's idea that this could work, and it worked. Carol passed away in January 2023, and Alberto guided us through many situations, and he helped as I was making the decision to fight the careless driving ticket. And he just passed away from cancer on the day of the National March for Life, just a few weeks ago. Carol was 59, I believe. Alberto, I believe, 41. And Don Hutchinson formerly of the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, he said of Alberto, and I think the same is true of Carol, we read stories of ancient England in which royalty select a standard bearer to represent them in jousting competitions. The Canadian courtroom is the contemporary jousting arena, and Alberto has become one of the standard bearers for religious freedom and other interests of Christ's church, Hutchinson said. And I think both Alberto and Carol were standard bearers. Carol would say she was supporting us in the frontline activism that we were doing to change hearts and minds on abortion. She said, I'm there to stand up for you and your rights. I'm there to back you up if people don't recognize your rights. And if you need a door kicked down, I'm there to come and kick it in for you, to get you into new places and new spaces so you can bring the pro-life message there too. So I just want to take a moment of silence here to remember these two heroes. Carol taught me how to fight. Alberto, I learned so much from him about what that fighting looks like as well. And I know that if either of them were here today, they would tell you that we need to stand up, that we don't always win, but that we can win, and that it's always worse if we don't fight back. That we need to stand up and defend our voice so that we continue can continue to be a voice for the vulnerable. Hundreds are being killed every day in Canada. And we know what must be done to bring an end to the killing. We need to reach our culture with the truth about abortion. And if people don't see the victims, don't see the children, whether that's ultrasound photos or abortion victim photography, how are we going to bring an end to abortion? And if we don't have our right to speak, how are we going to speak up for the weak among us? Somebody, after all, has to make a start. How can we expect righteousness to prevail unless there are people willing to give themselves up to a righteous cause? There's more info on the website defendourvoice.ca. I'll make sure to circulate these cards, and we all need to stand together if we're going to protect our voice in order to be a voice for the vulnerable. Thank you. Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, great, thank you.
Do you want to take questions?
I can take questions.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah. Okay. I'll give you this mic and I can use that one.
All right. Get it over.
Thank you.
Questions?
Thank you for your presentation. One thing I was the head of the York Pro-Life back in the 1970s. And attending this meeting, one thing I noticed that's changed pretty dramatically is that this meeting is almost, I don't know, I could be wrong, but almost entirely Catholic. The membership is almost entirely Catholic, whereas before it didn't seem to be that way. While I see that as a strength on one level, I see it as a weakness on another. I think, you know why? Because, yes, our faith animates us and motivates us, but at the same time, it limits, if we keep presenting it as a faith-based argument, how do we present it to Muslims and atheists and so on? Because they can just say, well, that's your position. You're entitled to that as a Catholic position. Okay, that's number one. Secondly, related to this, what are we offering to people when we defend our position, which I agree with 100%. But what are we advocating for those people to give them supports if they're finding themselves in situations where they're considering abortion? You know, like financial supports or whatever, after they have the trial. Or I'll even give an example that some people might get upset with, but true. Some Catholic female teachers who are unwed find themselves getting dismissed from schools. I'll leave that to you.
Right. Thank you. So on the first point, I agree with you strongly. I don't think I made a religious argument. I mentioned freedom of religion because freedom of religion, I guess with Talia's complaint, it was a pro-life creed rooted in the teachings of the Catholic Church. Now, that was her as an individual making a case against the discrimination that she was facing. But I think there's a distinction between how we defend pro-life free speech and how we use pro-life free speech. So my focus is on defending our right to speak, you know. So I don't know if the room is majority Catholic here or not. I think that the Catholics here today have been the most vocal, but I'm not sure if the room is majority Catholic or not. I was the only Catholic on staff for my organization on this half of the country for several years. I've been in many pro-life circles that are predominantly Protestant, and I think that we need a Big Ten approach. We need Catholics, Protestants, Christians, Muslims, atheists, we need anyone who agrees with us when we're talking about anti-abortion efforts. Anyone who's anti-abortion, I'm happy to work with, and we have a multi-faith team with Toronto Against Abortion, for example. And when we use, speaking to my experience with Toronto Right to Life with CCBR, when we use our freedom of expression to have these conversations about abortion, we're making arguments based on science and human rights, that we can reach people of any faith or no faith at all. When it comes to the discrimination that we face and seeking legal remedies, that's where the notion of freedom of religion or discrimination on the basis of creed can sometimes come into play. With Talia's complaint in particular, that expansion in the definition of creed, it was to things that we would not consider traditional religions, but that could be considered a system of beliefs, like veganism was kind of giving protection under the creed, part of the code. So Talia argued that pro-life beliefs on their own should count as creed, and the tribunal hasn't ruled on that, but the tribunal said, you know what, pro-life beliefs grounded in your Catholic faith, that's good enough, that counts. So not Catholic faith alone, but that kind of connection between the two. When you make the legal arguments, you always have your 1, 2, 3, you know, so you have your backup arguments in place. So I think that when it comes to discrimination and legal avenues, we need whatever is possible. And if it is a religious pro-lifer who is being discriminated against, then there might be some remedies there legally. But that doesn't mean that there should only be religious pro-lifers or that there should only be Catholic pro-lifers. When it comes to the second question, I agree entirely. I think that's the not even the second, but even beyond that. Like when I'm talking about how we defend our freedom of expression, I'm not even talking yet about how we have the conversation about abortion, or never mind what solutions are. But I was thinking about this during David Reardon's talk. A colleague of mine and several other pro-life leaders have signed a statement, you can read it at postrowfuture.com. It's for an American context, but I think relevant in Canada as well, advocating for an increase in supports that can decrease the demand for abortion, with better maternity leaves or child benefit care or reduction of student loans, the kind of family-friendly policies you see in places like Hungary, or that in some wings of the Republican realignment have been proposing, things that can help reduce the unwanted abortions we were learning about this morning by alleviating those socioeconomic pressures. So I think that's really important too. But what we do at a policy level to try and reduce the abortion rate is separate than what we do as a policy level to try and defend our free speech. I think those are different kinds of legal things.